Okay, there's still a few people coming in. We're up to very busy schedules to come along and listen to what we're proposing. Secondly, my name's Steve Turner. Some of you may know me. I'm director of 3CI, which is the Cities Commission for Climate Investment. Perhaps a little bit of a talk around what 3CI is. 3CI was set up 18 months ago, and initially an initiative between the Connected Places Catapult, core cities and London councils. We've since expanded that governance structure to include key cities, the M10. We're working very closely with the LGA and the Scottish Cities Alliance. So we cover about 95% of local government. Our aim and purpose really is to support local government in all its manifestations to secure the necessary finance to delivering on their net zero ambitions. I'll talk a little bit more around some of the programs that we're developing. But we've got a fairly substantive governance structure that includes an advisory board, which is made up of high-level political representation from the leaders of core cities, from London councils, the M10, key cities and Scottish Cities Alliance. And it's chaired by the Connected Places Catapult chair, Greg Clark. That's the professor, not the minister. So what I'll do now, if I may, is I'll just drop down towards the agenda for this morning. So I'll give a little bit more background on 3CI, who we are and what the work that we do, which is helpful context, I think, for those of you who don't know. I'm going to talk very briefly in terms of the model that we've been developing and launched last week at a regional investor event in London, because that's the context within which these proposals sit. I'll then talk a little bit about what we are looking for, and then what we're not looking for. Some next steps, then an opportunity for people to post questions in the box at the top of your screens. So it should take no more than an hour. It should be over in an hour, hopefully within the hour. Probably the first half hour will be myself and my colleague Chris Murray talking around some of the work we've been doing, and then opportunity for us to answer some of your queries and questions. So I talked a little bit about 3CI, what we do and what we're about. We have 5 major programs of work, and these aren't things that we've invented. They're very much born out of the conversations that we've had with a whole range of our member local authorities to understand some of the challenges that they have in terms of addressing and bringing forward finance to achieve net zero. And what we're not in the game of is providing capital finance. There's plenty of capital finance we know in the markets. What we're focusing on is the development finance. How do we support local authorities in terms of bringing projects forward for investment? And we've identified, I guess, 5 major challenges, or 3 arguably challenges initially, that local government is facing in this context. The first is clearly around the ability to attract private finance. Our first report, which we published 18 months ago, identified a 208 billion opportunity or cost for local authorities in both core cities and London councils to achieve net zero. And that figure is clearly way beyond the realms of the public purse to fund. So we have to develop new innovative mechanisms for how we bring in and leverage private finance to support local authority ambitions. And that's why we developed this net zero neighbourhood context, which is the focus of this proposal. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail after this slide. The second challenge we identified is around scale. So typically a local authority project is within the realms of about 5 million, whereas a private sector investor really isn't going to get out of bed for less than 30 million. So we've got a gap. So what we did some time ago is we established something called the National Net Zero Project Pipeline, and a number of you in your local authorities will have submitted projects into that pipeline. We've now got over 1,000 projects from over 50 authorities with an investment value between 40 to 60 billion pounds. They're all, of course, at different levels and stages of maturity, but we're working with a range of organisations currently to move those to address and understand what that maturity is and where they can be brought forward. And I think this is quite important because from an investor perspective, it's a one-stop shop, if you like, for them to look in and see what projects are being developed and what scale they're at. The other advantage, I think, for lots of investors is that we can start to think about packaging some of these projects at a regional level for investment, but also on an asset class. And by that, I mean, we could see how many authorities want to do EV charging infrastructure and work with investors to fund some of those projects. And then the third program, arguably, is around the National Technical Assistance Program. We know, and I know from 20 years in local government, that there is a real challenge around the skills and capacity within local authorities to bring projects forward for investment from private finance, a real challenge. Previously, a number of authorities in the UK were able to access the ELENA facility run by the European Investment Bank, but clearly that's not available now to UK local authorities. So we are looking to design and build something that replicates that enables local authorities to access the sorts of skills and capabilities, possibly from third parties, possibly from pooling the skills and expertise across local authorities, to bring those projects forward investment, may they be in the pipeline or the net zero neighbourhoods. We also run two programs, which, if you like, are around knowledge transfer. The first, we run a series of regional investor events where we bring projects from the pipeline at a regional level and share those in a kind of a dragon's den concept with regional and national investors. We've run these in Bristol and Glasgow, and last week in London, and we plan to do others going forward, including a combined one across Yorkshire in the autumn. And last but not least, we have a programme of dissemination of local and regional innovations around net zero financing, creating a whole range of case studies. We're looking at developing some active learning programmes, including the potential rollout of Bristol's LEAP programme, as well as developing communities of interest, communities of practice group, which Chris may comment on in a minute. And finally, we also commission and deliver specific innovation accelerator reports based on the needs and challenges of local government. We published one of these, which was specifically around supporting local authorities in terms of attracting private finance. And we're due to publish a second one later in the summer, which is on community engagement. So I'm going to focus on the first of those, which is the net zero neighbourhoods, which is the focus of this proposal. So it's a key fundamental of our work. As I say, we published the first report 18 months ago, which identified that £208 billion figure. On the back of that, we were successful in securing £1.5 million from BEIS, as was, to fund the outline business case to Green Book compliant standards, which we launched the full business case again last week, which is available on our website, and I will put a link in that at the end of this presentation. But this is a new approach, and it's very much place-based. This is not looking at specific assets. It's a place-based approach that looks at the benefits of place, where the opportunities to cross-finance between more attractive investments such as renewables against some of the more challenging ones around retrofit, but also, of course, at place level, we have the opportunity to grow jobs and businesses much more rapidly and accelerated than we would investing in a single asset class. I'm not going to go into detail in the model. You can find that, if you so wish, in the full outline business case, which I said we'll provide a link at the end of this webinar. The call for proposal, I really want to emphasize this, and I'll say it again during the conversation, is it is not a competitive process. It is not a competitive process. What we're seeking to do is to speak and identify from local authorities the potential net zero neighbourhoods that may exist in the UK with a view to bringing forward a programme. That said, we have developed quite a detailed model. We're not expecting you to read the detail of that model or deploy it in terms of your proposals. But I thought it would be helpful just to give a flavour of what that looks like. It is a blended model, so it looks at a range of asset classes: EV charging, building retrofit, community waste, natural capital, transport, and renewables, within a proxy area of approximately 1,000 properties. And it's very much predicated on the householder not having to pay any upfront costs. I'll talk about that in a minute. But what we really want to, on the back of the outline business case, is now sort of create confidence in the market. We've already got interest from a number of private finance institutions, Aviva and L&G being two of them, in terms of funding some of this work, because the model works for them as patient capital investors. So why is this model different from other ones? Well, I guess a lot of approaches are single interventions around a single technology. This is very much place-based, as I said. It looks at 6 different asset classes and is bedded in place, hence the real importance to engage with and work with local authorities, who we have done thus far. A lot of models really are based on retail finance. This is institutional investment, very, very different. And the upfront costs investment are typically in the past have been required individual homeowners to make that investment. This is not the case on this model. It's the investment that comes from institutional investors, and there's no cost or charge to the house, to the homeowner. Last week, when we launched the Outland Business Case, we had a presentation from the London Borough Council, and they are starting to think about this approach within their own borough. And their chief executive shared some slides, which I thought were really, really good in giving an illustrative example of how the model works in practice. So what we've got here is the current approach. So, you know, a typical family there, Zara and her family of 4, living in a 3-bedroom detached home, EPC rating D. Those are her bills and the costs per annum. She has to pay upfront that money to get that house retrofitted. And then that generates obviously savings on the energy costs. Some of that is obviously passed into the energy provider, and she makes a saving of £3,000 per annum. Typical. This is her sort of model. So it's going to take her 18 years or whatever to see the savings from her own investment. Our approach is quite different. Similar family, similar house, same costs, but the retrofit is not funded by Zara. The proposal in the model is you set up a finance vehicle which goes out and secures the funding from institutional investors. And you can do that because we're not looking at individual properties, we're looking at 1,000 properties minimum. And it's that sort of scale, that sort of level that institutional investors are interested in. And that money will not only pay for the retrofit on the house, but it also be used for wider neighbourhood improvements, including green spaces, cyclaways, and EV infrastructure. So it's not a cost onto Zara and her household. Obviously, some of the returns from those investments go back to the investors, and also onto the energy providers as well. And Zara still makes a saving. I won't go into any more details on the model because that's not what actually we're asking for in these proposals. The proposals themselves, what we're aiming to do with them is create a national pitch book. And our aim for that is threefold. One, we want to share that with government with a view to forming the basis of a national programme subject to funds becoming available. As I said, we've already had funding from DESNES, this is now, and we're having in-depth conversations now with the Treasury about moving towards the next steps on this programme. And we felt, as 3CI, and with our steering group and our local project partners, now was the right time to cast the net wide to see what initiative may be being brought forward that would fit a net zero neighbourhood model. We also want to share this pitch book with potential private sector investors. I've already mentioned 2. There are a lot interested in that. And Chris Murray may talk in a minute about the private financing task force that we've also set up. We'd also want to use it at the basis as an investor pitch events, which we attend, including COP28, where the Investor Summit, and others such as UK REIT. So what are we looking for in your submissions? I think, again, I will reiterate, we're not looking for a deep understanding of the model. We're absolutely not looking for that. An understanding of how it works, and you've had an executive summary, would be helpful, of course. We're looking for a description, identification of the location, ideally a red line around a map, if that's feasible. We're looking at something that has potentially around 1,000 properties, and having a mix of building type, residential, office, leisure, different physical infrastructure, diversity of neighbourhood. All those sort of things are really valuable information for us. Ideally, we'd have some evidence of political or senior support for the proposal, even if it sits within a wider regeneration or renewal scheme. If you have identified any potential funding that may contribute to either the further design or the delivery of the programme, even if it's not directly linked, we'd love to hear about that too. It's also important, I think, for us to understand the diversity of the community within which the neighbourhood would sit, the socio-economic mix. Anything you have on that would be really helpful. We're also looking for a mix of building types and ownership, but we don't want to rule out single building types or tenancy arrangements at this juncture. We feel that would be too restrictive, recognizing that many of these neighbourhoods may be under a single landlord, for example. I think one of the key things here, we're looking at a single geographic area. That red line around the map would be really helpful. And again, reiterating approximately 1,000 residential units. We're looking for, I guess, the application of technologies across a range of asset classes. We don't want to know what those technologies are really in detail. If you haven't nailed that, that's absolutely fine. But it's the sort of thinking and ideas that you may have around technologies that fit across residential, non-residential, energy to waste, renewables, sustainable transport, green infrastructure. We're not necessarily looking for all of those, but certainly we're looking for 3 or more, I would suggest. Thought I'd also say what we're not looking for. So we're not looking for a detailed explanation of how our model will be developed and applied in your area. We're certainly not looking for that. This is very high level proposals at the minute. Nor are we looking for, and in fact, there are no questions in the pro forma around breakdown of detailed costs and timescales and the number of people who need to be deployed. Absolutely not looking for that at this stage. And we're not looking for any detailed project design work. Finally, this is not competition. All of the proposals will be incorporated within that pitch book, subject to having sufficient detail. So the next steps before I hand over to Chris to make a few comments is that after this webinar, we'll circulate to everybody a short pro forma around which what we're looking for, the questions are that we're seeking to answer. As I say, we're not looking for detailed proposals, and the submit application by September the 8th. So I'm hoping that's a reasonable amount of time for people. There are 2 sides to the pro forma. There are limits on words, but that's the kind of length of work that we're seeking, or application rather. And if you do want to read through the 300-page outline business case, there's a link there at the bottom of the page. We'll obviously circulate these slides to you after the webinar. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'm just going to hand over to Chris Murray to add a little bit of detail, including the work he's been doing, A, on the task force, but B, the communities practice group that he's also set up, and then we'll get questions and answers from anybody that has them. Chris.
Brilliant. Thank you, Steve. And just to wrap a couple of answers into this from the Q&A. So, as Steve said, this is not a competitive process. It's also not a fund. This is a gathering together of projects that will be then presented collectively to private and other investors. So just important to say that. And there's another question in there about what might be acceptable and applicable in terms of types of project. As Steve said, we would prefer to see projects that are operating across more than one asset class at the neighbourhood level. I would say, if in doubt about any of that, just get in touch with us in a way which does not involve you doing more work. Just contact us and ask us the question or show us the project without doing more work, and we'll come back to you on that as soon as we can. So there's a couple of other things that we're doing around the net zero neighbourhood concept, and I would say that as Steve's sort of intimated, although we've got a business case which is very detailed, it's been produced to Treasury Green Book standard. There's a lot in there. What we're not doing is sort of slavishly pursuing that as the only means to delivering decarbonisation at the neighbourhood level or neighbourhood scale. We do think, however, that there's a set of principles within it that one arrives at when you look at the challenges of neighbourhood level decarbonisation. However you come at it, you arrive at the same set of principles, which is that essentially it needs to be place-based. It's going to be better if it operates across more than one asset class at the same time. And really, you need a blended finance model to make that work. It's not going to work with public subsidy alone, nor just with private investment, but a blend of those alongside outcome-seeking finance. This is all part of a wider attempt on behalf of 3CI to really shift the market toward new forms of innovative approaches to neighbourhood decarbonisation, and the investment models that go along with that. And that's one of the reasons why we're interested in the kind of diversity that we know is out there, and seeing that in a bit more detail and gathering it together around this set of principles, if you like, that we've got in our own outline business case. So there are two other major projects that we've got going in order to do that. The first, as Steve said, is a private sector led task force, which is really kicking the tires in some detail on that model, but also looking at these wider principles of neighbourhood decarbonisation, and where people give us permission and where it makes sense, we'd be interested in showing some of the projects to that task force. It includes the likes of Lloyds, NatWest, Aviva, L&G, Association of British Insurers, pension companies, building societies, and so on. So the lenders, the mortgage providers, the big patient capital companies, and we're asking them to dig down into that model and this set of principles and tell us what they think from their perspective. What are the barriers to investment from their perspective? What would incentivize them? What are the kind of returns that they might want to see coming in from their perspective? What are the different kinds of capital that might operate in different ways in relation to different projects? That task force will run, it's begun already, so it's had its first meeting. That will run probably up until about COP28, or with an interim report into party conferences in the autumn. And what we're aiming to do in terms of an output from that is speak to Parliament across parties, very cognizant of a general election coming up. We're also very firmly positioned in a cross-party space as an organisation, as a coalition, and also speak back to the rest of the private sector and to local government, and just to share all of that information. The task force is led by Catherine McGuinness, who was previously effectively the equivalent of the political leader of the City of London, deeply immersed and enmeshed in the finance sector. And we're also going to hold a series of evidence sessions beginning this month and then proceeding across the autumn. And there will be some local government representation, particularly from finance directors, as part of that. So we see this as a really kind of key piece of work in progressing the conversation between localities, investors and government about trying to shift the market toward these new forms of innovative finance at the neighbourhood level. The second thing that we're doing is developing what we're describing as a net zero neighbourhood community of practice. So this is gathering together the places that are about to or have already embarked on a substantial project that has some of the aspects of a net zero neighbourhood as defined in our own business case around the principles of that model. We know that nowhere is doing a full net zero neighbourhood. We know that that hasn't happened already, and that was, in a sense, part of the purpose of crafting that business case. The purpose of this is, is linked to the pitch book, so it has some similar objectives. But what we want to do here is to capture the learning from each of these projects, each of which we think will have different components of a net zero neighbourhood. So some might be more focused on transport, others more on retrofit and so on, and gather that learning together in a way which almost creates a kind of virtual evidence base for an evidence base for a virtual full net zero neighbourhood. And that's really important in a number of respects. Firstly, because the private sector, who have been engaged throughout this process as part of 3CR's coalition, really like the model that we've developed. They think it will work. There's some adjustments that will need to be made. We know the model is not perfect, but we do think it's pointed in the right direction. In order for them to get their checkbooks out for this, we need to create confidence for them that this actually is going to operate in practice. So that evidence base in creating market and investor confidence is incredibly important. The second thing we'll do from the community of practice is to provide support. So where we see a place has real potential in moving this concept forward, then we'll try and find ways of supporting them. We'll also create peer group support between places. And the third thing that we'll do is we'll then, at the right moment, open up that community of practice to anywhere that's got an interest in this. They may not be doing a project, they may not even be thinking about doing a net zero neighbourhood style project at this moment in time, but we do think it's important that this learning is shared as widely, as openly and as transparently as possible, obviously respecting commercial arrangements and political priorities within that. So our aim is that through this work, the task force community of practice, the pitch book, that we'll begin to build up a head of steam behind these projects that are aiming for neighbourhood level decarbonisation at scale across multiple assets with, often fairly complex and certainly innovative financing arrangements at the heart of them, and really avoid reinventing the wheel as well. So we do think that some of the procurement, the contracting, the legal side of this is likely to be very similar, if not completely the same, between different places, and we'd like to help places to create a kind of playbook and a toolkit and a sort of modularized set of documentation, of tools to get this going in terms of procurement and legal, where that makes sense to do so. So I hope that's answered a couple of questions and just given you a flavour of some of the other things we're doing around the really important project that Steve's described. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Chris. We're just working through some of the questions. I don't know if it's a facility for people just to sort of shout and ask them, actually. It's been very much us broadcasting to you. I'm just trying to go through some of these, which we haven't answered. Got one, I think I've been trying to type them in. Green Finance Institute. So someone from Jez Tweed is asking, does this work link with GFI's work on residential retrofit, green bonds, green mortgages? It does, and we've been working very, very closely with the GFI. In fact, the GFI supported us in terms of critically reviewing the model itself. I think it's probably fair to say a lot of them, their models are very much focused on single asset approaches as opposed to blended ones. And quite a lot of it is retail finance as well. So we are working very closely with them on it. And they, as I said, they've been quite a close critical friend. And I think the other thing to say probably is, there are lots of different financial models. Let's not pretend there's a one size fits all. But this is our particular approach that we've been developing. Through Lamia,
there's a couple on. There's one on Scotland, and yeah, we 3CI is UK wide. So Scottish Cities Alliance, for example, sit within our governance, and we are in dialogue with Scottish Government. Our relationships, are sort of slightly different with UK government because they've funded the work that we've done, but we'd be very interested in seeing projects from Scotland as well, absolutely. And then there was two questions about flexibility, one on number of homes and replicability, and I think, yeah, we would certainly at this stage be flexible about that. And I think scale is important, Steve said, in terms of where investor interests are, but certainly at this stage we'd be interested in seeing projects on a flexible basis, and replicability, scalability, really important, but we can't guarantee that at this moment in time. And then there's another one from George. Hi, George, on working with existing projects. Really good question. What we don't want to do here is separate this out from good practice that's already started, that's already taking place. And, absolutely, it's got to build on that. So if you've got a one-stop shop that's operating in that way, and this can be built around that, and that can become the vehicle for that, at least initially, then that certainly would suit our aspirations as well. So there's a couple of other questions. So I'll ask this one. Green skills, and have a look at some of the others, Steve. Coming in thick and fast. So I think, excellent question about green skills and jobs. And we know, of course, that there is a a benefit here. And retrofit, for example, as I'm sure many of you know, delivers on some calculations more jobs than new build. So we think there's a massive benefit here. This is really important in terms of the model that 3CI has developed, because within that is some very close monitoring of ESG and other socioeconomic benefits, which allows crowding in of outcome-seeking finance as well. Public investment obviously is predicated on things like jobs as well as carbon quite often, but other outcome-seeking investment, philanthropy, social investment, who've shown a very strong interest in the model, would have those kinds of aims as well. Within that question, I think there's a sort of another implicit challenge, which is about the supply chain. And supply chain currently, we know if we suddenly kind of had the wherewithal to get on with all the retrofit we need to do, the supply chain just isn't there to do it. So, we're having conversations with those that have a responsibility for developing supply chain, but currently that does sit outside of the immediate concerns of 3CI, which are very specifically with how do we crowd more investment into net zero neighbourhoods and local net zero projects alongside the public investment that's been allocated. So I hope that answers the question in some way.
There's a question from Jez, actually, just typing. Can I ask how you tested this approach on the finance market, and how would the projects be pitched to? I don't think we've answered that, have we, Chris? So in terms of developing the business case, we had private investors as part of that steering group. So they were part of helping shape the actual model itself. So they've been involved in that. And obviously, Chris has just talked around the task force, which are going to give it another, if you like, review. So that's been the process thus far. And how would the projects be pitched to? Well, we have to work that one through, I think. But I think there's our idea is that a pitch book could be taken to a number of different audiences, either on a face-to-face, a round table. As I said, there's a whole range of regional investor events. We attend COP on a regular basis, and the idea is perhaps to do a cities investment summit, of which this would be a piece in that. There's UK Reef. We do a whole range of regional investor events with investors, so there's an opportunity to share through those as well. So a whole range, I guess, of different channels to be exploited in terms of accessing regional investors.
So I'll take that next to Steve from Oliver and Ian. So in terms of the balance between where private sector interest might fall, it's a really good question. In terms of what you send in for the pitch book, I think we're quite agnostic about that. And we'd go with whatever your expectations or agreements are currently. In terms of the model in the business case, what that tries to do, in theory, is to spread investment, return and risk across multiple asset classes within a single vehicle. So this is theoretical at this moment in time, in a way where so the private sector would invest into that vehicle. That vehicle would then undertake a number of projects. It would perhaps include EV charging and retrofit, and maybe a couple of other things as well, but ensuring a return overall to the private sector. And one of the reasons that we've, thinking of going down that route is it avoids cherry picking. So you don't just get private sector investing in things like renewables, which give a decent return, and retrofit is left to public sector when we know there isn't enough juice in the system to do it. And really good question about RPs. We've had a couple of conversations with them. Yeah, we had a really good conversation with social investors and RPs, and they're very interested in the model. And we do think that there is the potential to pilot this with some of the bigger RPs, but we're at the beginning of that conversation.
Sergio, just in terms of the maximum number, there isn't a maximum number, but I would just say I guess it's in your thinking to be practical and sensible what's really achievable. I mean, if we start to talk about 10,000 properties, gosh, that gets into pretty big stuff. So it's just more about practicalities, really.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do take Helen and Richard. So risk register,
Yeah.
absolutely. You know, this is such a key issue, isn't it? Where does risk and liability sit within this? And that leads you to all sorts of conclusions, you know, like whether money can be on or off balance sheet for public sector, you know, how the money is collected actually relates to that as well. So there's a chunk of work to do here in terms of the 3CI outline business case when we get to what we hope will be a full demonstrator of that, which is reliant on some government funding further down the line, and the preparatory work for that has been set out in the business case does include a lot of work around risk assessment. So completely agree with that point. Who would collect the savings? That I think we at the moment we have a flexible view on that, but we do think that a vehicle, a financial vehicle, which is able to contract with the homeowner and the energy companies and has some independence, it would have, you know, almost certainly some kind of democratic representation, but some independence to give it stability and longevity over the long term, because the payback periods for the retrofit model within the business case are quite long. They're up to 40 years. So we think that sort of independence and longevity is really important.
Should we take this in turn, Chris? Give you a bit of a break. Shall I take Andrew's next?
Please.
You're not looking for next. So a neighbourhood that is ready to press the button on for delivery is one that can be developed into full delivery. It depends how close it is, Andrew. Actually, I think we would be interested in one that is close. To be honest with you, so please don't be afraid of submitting that. And that goes to another question, which was how many submissions can you submit? It's a really good question, and I think initially we thought one per authority, but I'm open to that actually. So if you want to submit more than one, then please do so. But it would be helpful if you did prioritise them actually. So Andrew, please, you know, that's a yes, really. Chris, over to you now, Charlotte.
Yeah, so it's Charlotte and Thomas. Again, these are great questions. I think well, I'd sort of try and distinguish, I think, in the questions between, so there's questions that are coming in about our own business case, which is, I mean, just to sort of underline the point, at this moment in time, a theoretical deep dive into one way of delivering net zero neighbourhoods, and within that retrofit in some detail. The call for proposals is slightly different to that, because we know that there aren't projects out there that are doing the kind of totality of a net zero neighbourhood. So we're interested in seeing projects that are doing some of this or touching up against the principles that we describe in the business case. So that said, two very good questions there. One on the sort of dynamics of tenancy and tenure, and we don't have a full answer to this. You know, we think that based on the studies that have been done from behavioural science, that doing it at a neighbourhood level, you're more likely to get more people signed up. And certainly the model could cope with different tenures. It could cope with having private owners, renters, and social landlords within the same neighbourhood. It should be able to do that. It could also cope with people opting out and not being part of it, or indeed wanting to pay for it themselves because they want to keep all of the saving themselves. And so therefore, you know, our expectation would not be, in majority of cases, probably most cases, that there would be a single landlord. You know, we understand it would be a complex piece, and community buy-in is utterly central to getting any of this away.
There's a question here, it's anonymous. So will it be packaged up as a whole or put forward to investors, or will investors be able to pick and choose? I don't think we've decided that yet at this juncture. I think in part that will be a conversation we have in the community practice group. If you have a particular preference, please let us know. But we'll also be guided, I guess, by the private investor group task force that Chris has mentioned as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And to Shona's point, I think that's a really interesting point. And my feeling, Steve, is yes, we would be open to projects that include resilience. And you know, we've focused a lot in this model on retrofit and energy saving, decarbonisation, but without resilience, obviously neighbourhoods are still going to struggle. So I think we'd be very, very interested to see projects like that. So on how the retrofit model, energy supplier scheme income. Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's this kind of bigger question within that actually, Simon, about energy companies' responses to measures which reduce energy consumption. And I think, our sort of assumption at this point is that retrofit needs to happen. Therefore, we're going to go ahead and try and do it. So the reduction for the energy company would only be, within this model, would only be from the reduction in energy consumption. That any other energy used would still be fully paid for within this model. It's just that some of the saving is redirected then to create an annuity for the investor, which then allows that investment to happen upfront to fund the retrofit in a way that we're not able to do at the moment. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, and the money stays with the property, not the homeowner. So
yeah.
So Harold, sorry, a good question on community support for the model. Absolutely. Our next innovation accelerator report will be on community engagement. It's really important, and we're not expecting people to have answered the question, but if you have done any degree of community support or got any thoughts around it, we excuse me, we'd really welcome those.
Yeah, absolutely. We don't have a time scale for investment flowing into actual projects at this moment in time. I think there's probably two answers to that. The first is in terms of full demonstrators that are set out in the business case, that is reliant on a chunk of money from national government. Given where we are politically and in terms of fiscal cycle, we think that is unlikely to happen before the general election, but we're engaged in conversations across Parliament on that. But we're not waiting for that to happen, and that really is the purpose of this work, the pitch book, the community of practice, the task force. We are trying to do what we can to understand the needs and the challenges of projects and to support those in ways that we can. We don't have money, we don't have a fund ourselves to spend on that, but we do have a very strong coalition with private investors, and we're starting to build those relationships, but it would be hard to say exactly when money might be able to flow from the results of those conversations.
Gareth's question on liabilities. Gareth, in the model we talk about establishing two vehicles, a FinCo which goes out and gets the finance from different sources, and an OpCo. The liabilities for the retrofit works would lie with the OpCo. The local authority would have a role in both of those. And in terms of financial obligations, once again, this is not the householder making the investment at all. So they're not having to repay the investor. That sits with the FinCo. Ray.
So the answer question about from Sergey, apologies if I'm not pronouncing that correctly, covering domestic and non-domestic. I mean, that in a sense that's exactly what the model is attempting to do. It's attempting to work across the complexity and the sort of multiple asset base of neighbourhoods. So if there are projects that are doing that, we'd be very very interested to see them.
A lot of the detail actually on the way these finances and liabilities flow is in the outline business case. There's quite a section on this in terms of the delivery piece and the management case. So apologies if it appeared to be skimming over those. There's a lot of questions on that, but the detail is, given the time, lies in that specific chapter.
Yeah, so a good question from Kelly. It's so what the business case does two things, and one is a fairly high level and the other is very detailed. So a fairly high level, it describes how investment might be corralled within a single vehicle to invest into multiple assets within a place including the regeneration of that place, which would therefore provide some investment for green infrastructure. Where it goes into great detail is the retrofit model. So we haven't gone into the same kind of detail on the kind of multi-asset investment model, but that certainly is the intention of how that kind of model would operate. Yeah, public sector covenant. I mean, it's, again, we're not, what we're not saying is that there's one way of doing this. There are different ways that will be, that will work better in different places. I mean, that's a sort of nature of a place-based approach. So in some places there might be, it may work better to have a financial company or financial vehicle which is totally independent of a local authority. In others, the local authority may feel that it's able to provide some sort of covenant. So, I think that would be open to local interpretation, but it would definitely have to fit with public sector procurement rules.
There's a question here on, so I a couple there, actually, Chris, in text.
Where's that? Sorry, Steve.
Sorry, I've leapt around here. Robbins, does the 100,000 people requirement effectively rule out rural neighbourhoods? These often aren't on the gas grid and getting traction. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't actually. It doesn't at all. You can have a very big red line that includes 1,000 properties. I recognise it. The model at the minute isn't really going to really disperse rural area. I think we have to be upfront and honest on that. But if you can get 1,000 properties within a rural, semi-rural area, then that would work. Indicative value regarding the size of investment the project should represent. Really good question. We estimated in the work that, and again, it's sort of set out in the business case, we'd be looking at a 50 million sort of range of investment. Again, coming majority of that coming from private sector, and that's set out in the business case. Question
about a GLA,
yeah, GLA.
Program. I think that's a really interesting suggestion. And that's certainly I think we'd be very open to that, but that's probably a matter for local partners to discuss. But GLA is very closely involved in the 3CI coalition, and we know obviously they launched their own fund as well around some of this work last week. So that would be an interesting conversation to have. Very, very open to that.
Yeah, we're talking with GLA. Adrian Newcastle proposed to demonstrate collaboration with DNOs, and how should you do it? Well, I probably guess just tell us to what extent you are, working with the DNOs. I know when we met with your colleagues, we were really interested in that approach. So the more you can tell us, the better, to be honest with you, and demonstrate any conversation you're having and engagement / partnership that you may be able to develop with them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we wouldn't want to do is put you to a load of work to get people to sort of sign up in a complex manner at this point. If we get to the point where we've got a pitch book and we've got investor interest and they're asking those sorts of questions, then we might need to go into more detail. So I was looking at a question, it's just gone now.
I just answered that one from Gavin. I just answered the Gavin one.
Right. Okay. Yeah, absolutely, Richard. And I would say to anyone else, if you've got challenges that you want relaying back to the department, we do have a very good working relationship with them, and I know they would want to hear that as well. So please just send those in to us.
Yeah, we meet them on a fortnightly basis. So that's yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, a question on community buy-in and residents. This is something that I think everyone is working through to an extent. What I think there's a very strong realization that without community buy-in, this just isn't going to work. And we looked during the research, we looked at many models, and one in Italy in particular, where they paid 110% of the retrofit costs. So they paid all of it and given the resident 10% of the cost on top as a bonus. And the take-up was really low. It was something like 20% of what was needed to get to net zero in those places. So this is a huge challenge. Who leads that, I think, is an open question. But I think certainly local authorities are much closer to their communities than any other kind of national body could ever be. So I think it absolutely needs to be led at the local level. But I also think that there is national work that needs to be done to change the narrative on retrofit and net zero, because people will just look at you blankly when you talk about that on the doorstep. And then you say you're going to take the house apart and you're going to put it back together and everything will be fine. And they hear, stuff on the news about that not going so well, including solar paneling recently. So I think there needs to be an effort nationally to shift the narrative toward growth, toward jobs, savings, and so on. So that's a partial answer, I'm afraid. So demonstrate an area, different technologies, anything else you'd be looking for? Yeah, I think we'd be really interested to see the social demographic. And, everywhere needs to do this. Everywhere needs to be able to do this at some point. But, I think we recognise it's going to be more challenging in places with vulnerable, lower income communities. So we'd certainly be very interested in that.
Is it expected the low cost of engagement, procurement of contractors, project management is met by the local authority? No, that's going to be met by the OpCo, which will be set up alongside the FinCo. That's what their role would be. Having said that, in terms of the governance structure, we would absolutely expect the local authority to be part of that. And in a way, I think it's up to the local authority to what level it wants to play in a net zero neighbourhood and what degree it wants to get involved and commit resources. And that will be, partly that'll be a political decision, of course.
So another question about money forthcoming. So it's a very good question, and of course, that's what people want at a need at the end of the day, as well as the other kinds of support. But I just want to be really, really clear about this. We don't have a fund, and we can't guarantee any investment will come from this process. We think it's very likely that the sum total of effort that we're engaged in here across pretty much the whole of UK government and the investment community will lead to a shift in market interest and appetite to invest in local net zero projects. But what we're not able to say is that X project will in X months or years be eligible for finance. This is a more, at this moment, more of a high level process of trying to push forward the principles of this kind of work in order to create that kind of market shift and investor interest. Investors are saying that they are interested in it, that that this will lead to investment. So we're very, very hopeful that it will. We're very positive about that, but I just want to be really clear in terms of managing expectations that that's not where we are at this moment in time. Is that a fair summary, Steve?
Yeah, that's good. And just a few minutes left. The PFI question, cost of living. So that's a really good question, actually, and I can see where it's coming from. However, it is quite different from PFI. Debt ownership repayments are not on the local authority at all. It's on the FinCo and OpCo, so it's separate from the local authority. So there is that piece. However, when one starts to get into detail, we haven't got to, this is where the full business case will work. We're not expecting this level of detail, of course, at this point. It's the FBC where those intricacies absolutely need to be worked out, such that parties are comfortable with those risks.
Another good one on mortgages. So we have got a number of mortgage companies involved in the coalition, and again, they do like the model. I think that's a very good question, and I don't think we've fully answered that. There's another sort of subtext for mortgage lenders, though, which is that they're quite interested in having mortgage packages that do this, because that's part of their business model. We know from the analysis we've done that mortgage take-up on this is going to be always going to be incredibly low. So there is a slight tension beneath the surface there, I think, in terms of mortgage lenders and retrofit.
Rob, I think, submit to government. Well, we won't really submit them to the government per se. We'll have a conversation with them. How quickly would you expect they to be ready to develop their governance? Well, I think the next step after that would be to fund full business cases. And the proposal in our outline business cases, that does need to come from central government. As I said, we are having detailed conversations with Treasury around that. In reality, I'm not sure that we will get funding for full business cases this side of a general election. But that's not necessarily the case. The conversations with Treasury are quite well advanced. And I think when we get to full business case, that's when we do the detailed work. And that is likely to take 12 to 18 months.
Yeah.
Before you start to get into delivery. So it's quite a long play out period, really, which might help people thinking about timescales.
So I think just to sort of, there's a lot of good questions in there as well, and we'll take all of those away that we haven't answered. Just to reiterate, what we're trying to do at this moment in time is not to ask you to do new work and think up new proposals at this point in time, but to look at the proposals that you're already working on, and for us to provide yet another route to presenting those to the investment community and to government, in the hope that at some future point some funding might flow into those. That is separate from the demonstrator process, which is outlined in the outline business case. That's, at the moment, there is no funding for that. That's a separate conversation with government, and should we get funding from that, then we'd be entering into a different dialogue with local government about where is best placed to make that happen at a really big scale. So I hope that's clear. Just in terms of managing expectations and not wanting you to put vast additional work into what you may think otherwise is a proposal for funding, which it isn't. What we're trying to do is find out what's going on out there at the moment and develop that into a pitch book. Is that clear, Steve?
Yeah, it is. Good. I mean, we will make the presentation available to everybody. We'll send you the pro forma and the link to the outline business case, and I'm sure there's some mechanism for getting all these questions and answers where we can as an FAQ piece as well, which maybe we'll put that on the website, actually. Might be easier.
Yeah, some really good questions there. Yeah, very helpful, actually.
Conscious of time, actually still 65 people, you're all sticking around, it's great.
Yes, I've copied all the questions.
So probably to sum up, really, if I may, given we're just slightly over time now, we're finished. So yeah, and as I said, we will send the pro forma out to people along with any further information. Do please, come back to us if you've got any further questions. This is not a competition, so it's a dialogue, if you like, over the next few months. I hope you've got our details, so please do reach out to us. We'll do our level best to support you in terms of what you're writing in your narrative as well, to guide you through that. We're not a massive team, however, and then we're just asking for people to submit their applications. And I say it's not big. They shouldn't run to any more than 4 pages of A4. We tried to put a bit of a word limit to sort of guide you through that by September the 8th. And again, if you've got issues with that deadline, please do let us know. So, I mean, I guess, thank you very much, everybody, for your phenomenal interest in this. That's really great. It's great to hear. And I think it's great that we can tell government that we've had over 70 local authorities attending this webinar, pretty short notice, actually, with a view to sort of thinking about this approach. I think it demonstrates the appetite and the demand for this. And we will do our level best on our side, working with our networks to support you and having those conversations with government. So thank you very much. We really look forward to your applications, and as I said, please do reach out to us if you've got any further questions or queries. Chris, anything you want to add at the end? Simon?
No, that's great. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everyone. Brilliant.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day, everybody.